Well, good evening. I'm Julie, and I'm a childhood friend of Marlene and her family. Our families went to the same church, and she was actually a schoolmate of my brother and is still in touch with him, I think. And he tells me that he thinks she probably had a crush on him back in the day.
We always say that. Yes, well, it's true.
She's blushing.
Yeah.
Anyway, and I remember the lovely accents of her parents. And one of the delightful things about reading your book was knowing all the place names and the people that you were talking about. That was a special thing for me. But I will read the bio that Nancy very kindly sent, which says Marlene Baumgartner is the author of Back to the Land in Silicon Valley. And she blogs at marlenebaumgartner.com about gardening, natural foods, grandparenting, and more. A longtime resident of the Bay Area, Marlene teaches undergraduate courses on developmental psychology and educational theory at Gavilan College in Gilroy. She's currently at work on her first novel, as well as a book about 21st century grandparenting. She is releasing an updated and revised edition of her second book, Organic Cooking for Not So Organic Mothers. And here is my original copy.
My goodness.
The original.
Yes, I have mine right here too.
And that's Paper Angel Press, spring of 2021. She resides no longer in Santa Cruz with her border collie Kismet and enjoys spending time in her organic garden. So I think that's, I've gone over the personal connection there, but I do also have, I was mentioning the first book, and this is a well chewed up version also. And in fact, my little gathering of neighbors here in my room today, we usually have a little treat at the end of our group meeting. And I was planning to make the apple oak crumble, which is my go-to dish from that book. And I ran out of time. So we're not doing that tonight, but I just wanted to let you know that book has been useful and important. And I've loaned it to people and talked about the different chapters on the grains, and it really it was a good thing. So I will turn it back to you and let you continue with your end of it.
And now we're gonna turn it over to Marlene. She's gonna read chapter 1 of her book, and I'm going to screen share it so that you can read along if you like. And then we will take questions. So I think that for the questions, you can either raise your hand and ask them out loud when Marlene is done, or you can put your question in the chat and I will read it for you. Okay, so if you have your own copy of the book and you want to follow along, it's chapter 1. So Marlene, take it away.
I thought I'd start with chapter 1 just in case, and I suspect we do have a few people with us that may not have read my book. One of the most common questions I get when I do readings is, what made us want to move to the land? What was in our minds? Why did we think this was a good thing to do? And I think this chapter is the best way of introducing or answering that question. An adventure calls. It was November 1973, and my mother-in-law wasn't speaking to me. My husband, John, and I were living with our 11-month-old daughter, Donia, and our German Shepherd pup, Elsa, on Mount Hamilton, an hour's drive up a winding road from San Jose, California. We had courted on Mount Hamilton in 1966, announced our engagement at Thanksgiving at the Lick Observatory Diner, filled that night with astronomers and friends. We had worked in the technology sector for several years and attended college at night. Now we were back, living in a tiny apartment at my in-laws' home while we looked for a house. That afternoon, Bee had entered the kitchen just as Donia began rubbing mashed banana into her hair. I sat beside the high chair, deep in my studies. I felt grateful for these few moments of peace afforded by Donia's sensory exploration. blonde hair falling out of the scarf she'd tied around her head, Bea muttered a few choice words about my parenting and the state of the kitchen floor. She carried Donia away for a bath. I put away my book and reached for a sponge, feeling like Cinderella. How would you like to move to the country? John asked that night as he took off his coat and hung it on a kitchen chair, placing his new HP 45 calculator on the table for me to admire. Turning from the stove, I stared at him. Had he been reading my mind? You know I would. Ever since reading Little House on the Prairie as a teenager, I had dreamed of living on the frontier. After the banana episode, pioneer life sounded better than ever. In some ways, I was enjoying this interlude on Mount Hamilton, 25 miles from the city of San Jose, nestled into the foothills of the Diablo mountain range. It was isolated and beautiful. The idea of leaving it to live in busy Silicon Valley was not appealing. John worked as a computer programmer at Electromagnetic Systems Laboratory, ESL, in Sunnyvale, an over 2-hour drive away. It was 9 p.m. by the time we had this conversation. He looked tired from his commute, and I felt exhausted from picking up Donia's toys, watching the kitchen floor, cleaning her high chair and all the cabinets and other furniture that she had touched that day with her inquisitive, sticky hands. I served his meal, then collapsed beside him. A guy I work with at ESL, remember Quincy? He came over for dinner one night when we lived in DC. He stopped to chew his meatloaf. I did remember Quincy with some embarrassment. Newborn Donia had been colicky that night. Quincy had paced the floor with her while I prepared our dinner. Yeah, I remember him. Well, he roamed the halls this afternoon asking everyone he knew if they'd like to go halves on 10 acres of land. A high school friend of his wife, Dory, told them that her dad planned to sell a remote plot of land cheap to pay some debts. Where's the land? It's 34 miles south of San Jose in the hills west of Morgan Hill, above Chesbrough Reservoir. John drove back into his meal. When he came up for air, he pushed his long brown hair behind his ears, scratched his beard, and stretched his long legs. I have to stop here for a second because one of our participants, Kathy, was living in Alexandria even then, and she was part of this early part of our life when Donia was so tiny and we were living in Washington, D.C. So that's kind of fun to replay that. Quincy hasn't seen the land yet, but he's interested. It's only about a 40-minute commute to ESL. It doesn't have any electricity or telephone, but it does have a shared well and a road. John wiped his plate clean with a piece of French bread. I reached for his now empty plate. Thanks, love. You know I appreciate you cooking for me so late. Before I could grab his plate, he pulled me into his lap. We smooched. Between his long commute and our lack of privacy, caresses were a rarity these days. He laced his hands together across my waist so I couldn't escape. Before he arrived, I had changed out of my spit-up soaked house cleaning clothes into a Liberty print granny dress I'd bought in Cornwall, and I draped the skirt over his legs in what I thought to be an attractive pose. My dangly earrings tinkled and tangled in my long red hair as I wiggled to get comfortable. I pulled them free. When can we see this property? Dory wants to visit the land this weekend. They're going to drive there on Saturday and meet the owner. Should we tag along? It might be just what we're looking for. Seems a bit crazy, I replied, unlacing his hands, clambering to my feet and putting his plate in the dishwasher, partnering with a couple we don't really know. I watched him gulp the pink grapefruit juice I'd poured into a tall glass. He looked weary and his eyes were shuttered. No crazier than taking a baby to Africa, he quipped, grinning tiredly. The previous summer, we had flown from our home in Washington, D.C. to England to join a friend and members of the British Astronomical Association on a ship that sailed to the path of a solar eclipse off the coast of West Africa. It had been an amazing adventure that included a visit to drought-damaged Mauritania, followed by our return to Washington, D.C. and a cross-country trek back to California in our VW bus. Donia had been fussed over by everyone she met and adapted well to the time and scenery changes. She was a natural traveler. I can't disagree with you there. It wouldn't be the craziest thing we've ever done. I've been thinking about what you said, I began later, when John suggested a postprandial walk. The telescope domes, a schoolhouse, diner, and a dozen or so houses stretched along the ridge of the mountain. The loop road that connected them, flanked with trees and brush, allowed a view of the sky, the valley lights, and the telescope domes. We often walked the loop before bed. I do want to live in the country, I said, putting on my boots, but it would be nice to have a house. Yes, it would, but what are the chances we'll find one? In 3 months of looking, we hadn't found even a rental we could afford within driving distance of John's office. Property values had skyrocketed in the 4 years we'd been away from the Bay Area. The 3-bedroom home in Mountain View we had purchased for $12,500 in 1967 and sold for $14,000 in 1970 was now worth $36,000. The money we had saved from the sale of our last house fell short of a down payment. In 1973, the area north of San Jose, already being called Silicon Valley, was growing fast. The countryside had shrunk. What was once apricot and prune orchards in Sunnyvale, Mountain View, and Cupertino had become suburbs and acres of industrial development. Valco Business and Industrial Park, soon to be expanded into a huge shopping center, was built right over the top of where my aunt and uncle had once raised chickens and rabbits. But we couldn't stay on Mount Hamilton. John's mother and I had differing views on child rearing. I liked to give our baby lots of physical and emotional freedom. Bea believed in structure and rules. She also thought I'd been breastfeeding Donia too long and wanted to wean her to a cup. For the last 6 months, she and I had worked side by side in her classroom 3 days a week. We prepared and ate our meals together, often in stiff, uncomfortable silence, and we sat in front of the TV each night waiting for John to come home. I deferred to Bea in the classroom, but when it came to my child, I set the boundaries. Bea's tight-lipped silences told me, often, when we didn't agree. Bea was doing us a favor, I knew that. While we'd been out of California, a change in educational legislation meant that after September 1974, my bachelor's degree would no longer qualify me to earn an elementary teaching credential. In order to secure a credential before the deadline, I attended classes at San Jose State University. John's mother served as both the principal and only teacher at the one-room Mount Hamilton school. She supervised my student teaching and helped me with my homework. San Jose State required 2 semesters of student teaching in different settings. In 6 weeks, when the fall semester ended, I would need a placement at another school. I only had 1 more semester and a summer session in which to complete my coursework and practice teaching before the deadline. John loved his job at ESL, but felt increasingly exhausted by his twice-daily commute through the fields and orchards, and frustrated that his wife and mother weren't getting along. I was cranky and tearful much of the time. The stress had affected my breast milk supply. I checked on Donia. Pop, which is what we called John's father, was in the living room cradling his sleeping grandchild in his arms. "Go for your walk," he said. "We'll take care of her until we get back. We want to watch MASH anyway." I cringed. MASH was a dark comedy set during the Korean War. It romanticized war and included scenes of operating rooms with visible blood and wounded soldiers writhing in pain. I felt relieved that Donia was asleep. John and Elsa were waiting for me on the front porch. John led me along the dark driveway to the road. I linked my arm in his and felt his body relax. He stopped and looked up for a moment before continuing on. The total darkness that made Mount Hamilton a good site for an observatory also meant we could see the Milky Way and other celestial formations that were far less visible in the city. John had introduced me to the sky on our first date in 1966. We had met at the junior college where we both attended classes and worked in the data processing department. After dinner and a Kirk Douglas movie, John had driven to a popular makeout spot and actually shown me the stars. At 18, I was accustomed to boys my age having only one thing on their mind, and it wasn't constellations. After I got over my surprise, I found this 25-year-old man, recently out of the Air Force, far more interesting than boys my age. We talked until midnight, and he told me he hoped to work for NASA one day. His full name was John Owen Bumgarner, he told me. It was the tradition in his family to call the first boy John, but they all had different middle names. I liked his name, it suited him. No one ever called him Johnny or Jack. When I asked him to show me Orion's belt and the Pleiades, he had apologized for the June sky as if it were his fault. Neither the Orion Nebula nor the Pleiades star cluster is visible at this time of year, had explained, pointing to out Ursa Major and Minor instead. By the time John delivered me with a chaste kiss to my parents' front door, I knew I wanted to spend more time with this interesting person. We were married a year later at a little Methodist church in San Carlos. That year, we worked at Sylvania Electronic Defense Labs and attended classes at San Jose State. It was difficult to get all of our classes due to the returning Vietnam vets who were given registration priority. We moved to San Diego to finish our bachelor's degrees. Then after a summer traveling in Great Britain, we drove to New Mexico State University in Las Cruces for graduate studies. I dreamed of being the next Margaret Mead, but we soon discovered that the anthropology program we'd heard so much about resided at the other university, the one in Albuquerque. When I learned there were no graduate level courses in anthropology at NMSU, I settled for 6 units of educational psychology and a secretarial job. John studied astronomy. NMSU had just started a doctoral program in that field. His financial contribution came from the GI Bill. 2 years later, when things didn't work out for him, he went to work for ESL, and I stayed in New Mexico to sell our house. A year later, we moved to Washington, D.C., where John supported image processing software for ESL at a federal agency. I gave birth to Donia while we were there. As we walked that night on Mount Hamilton, I thought about the house we'd left behind in New Mexico. It had 5 spacious rooms, a deck where John had installed his Questar telescope, and a large yard, which I had filled with vegetables and flowers. It would have been a wonderful place to raise a child. I still miss the life we had planned there and hadn't completely forgiven John for abandoning his doctoral program and forcing us to move. I had given up an anthropology fellowship so John could go to NMSU, then left my ed psych degree unfinished to travel east. I still mourned those uprootings. Perhaps a new start would help. Now I was concerned more about family than academic achievement. I wanted so badly to create a cozy home for our daughter. John seemed to believe we could build one on this piece of property. By the end of our walk, I wanted to believe it too. The next day dawned sunny and bright. While I fed the thirsty plants in Bee's kitchen window box, I imagined our little girl in the country with a watering can, or feeding chickens and helping me weed a bountiful vegetable garden. The thought was seductive. As I drove Donia the 50 miles north from Mount Hamilton to my parents' home, where she stayed while I attended classes, I felt hopeful. Along the way, I sang "This land is your land, this land is our land" to Donia, and allowed myself to dream of a future in the country. "I think we should go with them on Saturday," John declared that night, just as I began to close my eyes. "I talked more with Quincy today. He's very energetic. I think he would make a good neighbor." I propped myself on my elbow. "Okay, let's consider this," I told him. I've been doing some thinking. If there's no house, where will we live until we can build some kind of structure? I thought we'd put up a really large tent. In the darkness, I couldn't tell if he was joking. I hoped so. "That's not feasible, John. Could we get a travel trailer or something? I still have to do my student teaching, and we can't live in a tent with a baby when it's raining. Let me see if my parents will loan us theirs." "How will we get water to the trailer? Can we run pipes uphill from the well?" "I'm not sure. We may have to put in a water tank above us to get pressure." "What about electricity? We can fuel most things with propane." "What's involved in dividing the land into 2 parcels? I haven't a clue." In the end, we decided that we didn't know enough to decide and agreed to meet Quincy and Dory on Saturday. It wouldn't hurt to look. I'd like to welcome Ellis and Sandy Dawson, who I see just slipped in. They knew my husband in the early days when he was in the Air Force.
Okay. Thank you, Marlene. I agree. That was a good place to start. Other than it, it's chapter 1, obviously, but I think, and also, I love that chapter because, I get excited about what's to come next, and you can feel the tension and the conflict brewing in that chapter. So, thank you. That was a great reading. Okay, so now we are going to take questions, and we did have a question submitted ahead of time. So I'm going to read that one first. And like I said before, you can either ask your question out loud, or you can put it in the chat and I will read it to you. So let me start.
Is that
with
the
this
question from Linda?
Yes, I'm going to start with the
Linda,
question.
Linda had already heard that first chapter, so she stepped out for a minute. You might want to wait till she comes back.
Okay, we'll do that. Okay, so while we're waiting for Linda, I'll open it up to the floor. So don't be shy. If you have questions for Marlene, you know, she
Do you want
is
to tell
very good at
people how they
answering questions.
Yeah, do you want to tell people how they can ask questions? They can put their hand up under reactions, or they can just wave.
Yeah, and I'll call on you. Or you can put it in the chat if you don't feel like speaking. I'll read it for you. But how about, see, I have some questions here too. So,
Mhm. You-
oh, Julie, go ahead.
So this is not about the book, but are the jars behind you from your garden?
Not all of them, but some of them certainly are, yes. When I moved to Calabasas, it was not quite harvesting season for some of these. Some of them are from the previous years. I'm having trouble growing herbs down here. It's so very hot. So some of these are commercial, but I use both. I have a set of 20 little jars that I do use for my own herbs that I grow.
So did your parents do gardening too, or was that something that you came by as you processed through your life on the land?
It's interesting. I actually wrote a memoir of my mother and father's life, one for each of them for their 80th birthdays. And I learned a lot about where my gardening gene came from. My mother grew up in what we would call in America, I think, a tenement housing. It was very small, very dark, covered with coal dust. It was in the north of England, in a woolen mill, a town that was basically a woolen mill town. And she had no garden at all in her house where she lived in the house. They just had a little tiny patio of flagstones that was the pathway to the privy. But her father had a little plot, as they do in England. They tend to have allotments. And he owned a little allotment, and he grew quite a few of the vegetables for the family. So when she was about 5 years old, he gave her a package of, I want to say lettuce. Yeah, I think it was lettuce seeds. And she grew lettuce, and then she sold it by going door to door in her neighborhood. She sold the lettuce to her mother's neighbors. And that was the first thing she ever grew. And she decided at that point that she was going to move somewhere someday where she could have a garden. And so after World War II, when they both returned to a bombed out village and not very many jobs, and definitely not enough housing, they decided to come to America and came to California. And she had a garden every year after that. She always had huge gardens. And I think it was from growing up where there was no beauty, no color, everything was black. And the garden made such a difference to her. So it seemed natural to me when I moved to my first home, she brought plants over, she brought plant pots of transplants for me to start.
Oh, great.
Kind of a longish answer, but it is definitely in our family now. My kids all garden. Even my youngest, when she was in college, had a little tiny pots of herbs on her windowsill.
I think that's a good segue into the next question, which is something that I think Marlene gets often. Speaking of family, can you talk a little bit about the reaction of your family to this book, and whether you had to cut things later or take things out, and speak to that a little bit?
Sure, certainly. First of all, the book took me over 20 years to write. I think that's not uncommon with a memoir. I began by just writing down little stories as I remembered them, little things that had happened at various times, and I wasn't paying much attention to the chronological order. Somewhere along the line, I got stopped at a couple of things. One was my relationship with my parents had been quite fraught in those early years living up there. They saw me moving to the land as a negative response to them bringing me to America. So they had brought me to America so I could have the finer things in life. And here I was moving intentionally to a place where there was no electricity and no water, which is where the way they grew up. And they were very hurt by that. And so we went through quite a period of not getting along very well and not talking to each other very much. My mother wouldn't visit me on the land. And I didn't want to write about that while they were still alive. So a lot of that just got put aside. And then there is a little bit of a spoiler. There is a major accident in the book, and I never was able to write about it. I could not bring. I kept leading up to it, and then I would stop right there, and I would say, and then I would stop. And it seemed like a certain amount of time had to go by before I could deal with those difficult issues. So that's the main reason it took 20 years. By the time I was ready to write the book intensely, and I was writing it every day, it took 2 years after that. And my parents had both passed away by that time. So that issue had gone away. The accident I needed to slog through it, and it was very painful, and it took a lot of emotional, took a lot of emotional intensity for me to be able to get through the description of the accident. I wanted it to be as graphic for the reader as it had been for me as I was in the accident. So I got all that passed, and then now the family that was still alive would be my brother, who I'm not in touch with, and my 4 children. My 2 oldest children had lived on the land with me. My daughter remembered quite a bit and wasn't really interested in rehashing it. My son was too young to remember it and was interested, but was very busy. So neither of them read any of the rough drafts. I sent to them a copy of the book in its final draft, just to say, here, this is your last chance. Please read it and tell me if there's anything you want me to take out. My 2 younger daughters were not on the land with me. They'd always wondered about it. And my middle daughter, is actually my stepdaughter, had always been fascinated by our time on the land. When we used to go on trips, she used to ask me to tell her a story about when we were on the land, or the time that the goat fell down the hill, or the time that the dog ate the chickens. And so after years and years of that, she knew most of the stories. And when she was newly married and didn't have any children yet, she attended a memoir workshop. And she came to me right after that. And she said, you got to do this. You got to go take that memoir workshop. And then you've got to write all these stories down, because the family needs to know these stories. So she was always my biggest champion. And I dedicated the book to her. My youngest daughter was never really that excited about it, but when she heard that I'd read a book, she said, yeah, she would read it. And she did. And she said she loved it. She thought it was great. My oldest daughter, I don't even know if she's read it yet. My son waited for the audiobook, and then he listened to it while he worked around the house, and he was fascinated, and he came to me with lots of questions. The first one being, what the hell made you move on the land, Mom? What in heaven's name made you think that was a good idea? When it came to the people who I talked about in the book who lived with me, I incorporated their ideas from the very beginning. I told them all I was going to write this. I asked them to tell me their memories, and then I sent them all draft copies of the book. The only things that anybody ever asked me to change were my friend Bob Fabini and his wife asked me to change the spelling of their dog's name. That was important to them. And a couple of people reminded me that this had happened before that, or this had happened before that. So they gave me some technical knowledge. Nobody asked me to take anything out about them. And I had made a decision from the very beginning that this was going to be my story, not their story. So I didn't get into the personal lives of any of the people who lived up there. That was intentional. And I left a few private details out that didn't really serve the story. I think the person who might have had the most to say was my first husband, John, who actually came up with the idea for me to write this book. And he and I worked together on a Google document, when they were called that, Google Docs, as he was being treated for cancer. He would text me at night and say, I just remembered something, I'm going to put it on the timeline. and he kept adding things as he remembered. But he didn't get to live long enough to read the whole book. So that's one sadness, but he's definitely in it.
Thank you, Marlene. Yeah, it's so challenging writing a memoir, and it's so true. You have to remember that you're telling your own story and not other people's stories. I think that's a good lesson for anybody that is thinking about writing a memoir. Before I go to some other questions, if anybody has, all right, we got a hand up. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm Barbara Battersby's husband, Dick. And my question is, when you and John went down to New Mexico State, why did he abandon his doctoral program in astronomy?
Well, that was one of the private details I decided to leave out of the book. No, that's okay, I'll tell you. He was much older than his professors, which is never a really good situation. And he had been in the Air Force, and he had worked on the atomic bomb, and he was very knowledgeable about programming, and he had loved astronomy since he'd been a very young man. And he had studied astronomy at a community college and at the bachelor's level. And he found himself with an advisor who was about 15, 20 years younger than him, who wanted him to use computer modeling. And John wanted to use visual astronomy, and he wanted to write his doctorate about that. One of the reasons he went to New Mexico State was because, I'm forgetting his first name now, but Professor Coffey was there. And the man who had, I don't want to say discovered, but found Pluto. They were both professors. They were both by that time emeritus professors of the university. And John loved them both. He was very good friends with both of them, and he worked closely with them. And that's who he wanted to have as his advisor. But he couldn't get that to happen. As emeritus professors, they took no doctoral candidates. So he fought with his young advisor and finally walked out of an exam and basically got terminated from the program. I held that against him for a very long time. I always wanted him to compromise, but compromise was not in John's vocabulary.
Then you had to go to Washington, D.C.
Well, he took a job at ESL on the East Coast, and then he was given an opportunity to service some software that they'd sold to an agency in Washington, D.C. So he came out for a one-year assignment to do that, to support the agency. And then we went back. And that's what I was musing over in my first chapter, because it looked like we were going to have to live in Sunnyvale or Cupertino or Palo Alto. And I didn't like any of those places.
That was a great question. And
yeah, that's a question I've never had before.
Yeah. There's always that one person that asks the question that nobody else has asked. So that's good. You got a gold star.
Yeah.
Julie.
Julie.
Hi.
Hi, we have a question over here.
I do have a question. The period of time, that early 70s, there was so much going on in the United States. And there were a lot of people changing some of the ways we did things. Did that influence your idea that, hey, we can leave this life and just go live our own way? You know, you've got those hippies. I remember I had a girlfriend that refused to wear a bra, you know, because it was the no bra type thing. And it was just, you wanted to be a little bit rebellious and be your own person. Do you think that influenced you going to the land?
It absolutely did. I took my bra off in New Mexico and didn't put it back on again until I got a job teaching college.
Did you have Band-Aids for white blouses?
We were influenced both by that movement to do our own thing, so to speak, but also by
We lost
your voice. Yeah.
We lost the audio here.
Yeah, something happened to your mic.
Oh, I can see me just fine.
Oh, there we go.
Now we
I don't
can.
know.
Am I
Yeah,
back?
no, you're good. You're back.
Okay, so the other side of, I mean, I was saying, yes, we were influenced by the mood of the time. And in New Mexico, we had definitely been able to experience that with others. I worked in what was called a listening center, the third ear, where people came in and talked. And so the idea of peer counseling was growing. I was working on a doctorate in psychology at that point, so that was reasonable. We started a food co-op, the Oregon Mountain Food Co-op, which, by the way, is still there today in Las Cruces. But when we came to live with my husband's parents, they watched the 6 o'clock news every night. That was before we had 24-hour news, right?
Yeah.
But into our living room came the Vietnam War every night, and I hated it. I couldn't get away from it. I was sitting there with my in-laws watching this with them because that's what they did. And I hated that. And I hated what was going on, the shootings that went on during that period. We were just so discouraged. We wanted to do something peaceful and pleasant and be with other people who wanted to do the same thing. So yeah, I would say we were following a trend. We weren't being particularly creative. Lots of people did this. Thousands of people did this.
Well, it's a good way to express yourself.
It
And
is that.
not to go along with what everybody says you should be doing. And you know, war is government.
That's right.
And sometimes you just kind of want to step back a little bit from what you don't 100% approve of.
Well, all during our college years, we had protests and sit-ins and marches, and we participated in some of them. And after a while, they just got to be annoying. They got in the way of getting an education. They got in the way of having a life, really.
Right.
So being up there on the land, we could be in harmony with one another and with the land. We could grow our own vegetables and grow our own animals. My children got to see goats born and rabbits born and chicks and ducks.
You know, it's beautiful.
It was.
Really is. It's beautiful and it's refreshing and it's real. It's 100%
Exactly.
real.
Yeah.
Well, and then too, our Julie, I'm sure you know our Julie, she's a healthy person. She can walk around the block.
And more.
Thank you. All right. Anybody else have a question? I have some here that I can ask. Okay. Marlene, can you talk a little bit about how you came to the craft of writing? Have you always been a writer?
I have always been a writer. When I was just in third or fourth grade, I started a newsletter for some of my friends, and I don't even know if they'd invented it, but I certainly had never seen any kind of a copy machine. And so I would draw this newsletter with columns that I drew with a ruler, and I wrote the articles on it, and I colored the pictures with crayons and pencils. And I made maybe 5 copies of that. And I did that by copying it over 5 times. And when I went to Girl Scout camp, which I think I started doing in about 3rd grade, I was the newsletter editor. Julie made a mention of us being at the same church. Her brother Charlie and I folded the bulletins every week, and I used to read them. And it gave me an idea of how to do that. And I wrote the bulletin for the next 3 or 4 churches I belonged to. And almost every organization I ever joined, I ended up being the secretary of. So I just got sort of practice writing that way. And lo and behold, when I needed to earn a living to get myself through college, I went from being a secretary to being an editor, to being a technical editor, to being a technical writer over a period of 10 years. And that helped me hone my skills as well. It's interesting though, technical writing is very different from the kind of writing I do today. And when I was working on my master's and my doctorate, that's a very different kind of writing too. So I had to be kind of bilingual.
I was just going to ask that, what was the biggest thing that you had to shift in your mindset from, writing the cookbook to writing a memoir or the previous nonfiction that you had written?
Well, I'll never forget the comment of my advisor when I turned in the first draft of my doctoral dissertation. She said, it feels like you're writing for McCall's magazine. She said, you can't do that. You got to make it more academic, more objective. And of course, that made me a better writer too. Even when I'm writing memoir, I now know to put in the details. I now know to do the research. And so it was all helpful. It was all good.
What kind of support did you have while you were writing, like during the 2 years of actually writing your memoir? What kind of support did you have?
Well, I had come to a kind of an impasse. My daughter is a coach, a life coach, and she heard me say way too many times, I really should finish that memoir. And one day she said to me, you know, in my business, when I'm coaching people, when they say something to me several times, I force them, do you really want to do it? Or do you really just want to say, I don't want to do this? Or if you really want to do it, what is the barrier that's keeping you from doing it? And she said, I think I'm a writing coach. And I asked her if she'd help me. She said, no, I don't work with my family, but I can recommend one for you. So she did. She recommended Helen McLaughlin, who has become my angel. She wasn't cheap. It cost me more money to write that memoir than I will ever make out of it. But it got it past that place where it was just sitting there in my life waiting to be written. It was a story that had to be told, and I couldn't seem to tell it. So a very skillful writing coach sort of coached me chapter by chapter. We started out by saying, what are the most important themes in the book and which chapters should we put those in? We mapped it out. We talked about what I was going to do over the next 10 days, what I was going to do each day. And then at the end of the 10 days, she held me accountable for that. And that was an absolutely wonderful approach. I'm still very much in touch with Helen. She reads my blog and she nearly always comments on it. But I've written 2 more books since then without her. So she got me past the part that was hard and taught me some skills, some techniques that made the writing much easier.
I'm just waiting to see if anybody has a question after that. Well, that's great. I'm glad that she got you over the hump because we got a wonderful book out of it. And actually, one of the questions that Linda had was, what did it feel like to finally finish the book? What was the biggest reward for you?
It was the reward of being able to offer it to my children if they wanted to read it. But the most interested people were the ones who lived up there with me. They were just so grateful that I had captured our time, that their children could read it as well. So that was pretty nice. And I belong to a group of people who goes to the Strawberry Music Festival every year in California. As you know, nobody's been going to music festivals lately. So we meet on Wednesday nights by Zoom with a glass of wine in our hands. We call it our Strawberry Happy Hour. And 2 of the people who were up at the property with me are in that same group. We're all still friends. So it was pretty exciting to have them tell me that they read the book to their children and to their grandchildren, well, portions of the book. I don't know if they read the whole thing, and that they were sharing it with them. So that to me was probably the greatest thing. And then when my sons started asking me questions, they were questions that were really about the content of what we did during the time we were there, decisions we made, why we did what we did, why we grew what we grew. Why the dome took so long to build, why his father had such trouble keeping a job. There were a lot of things buried in this book that provoked questions that he then asked me, which he would never have asked me otherwise. So that was pretty cool.
That is great.
Julie?
I did have a question too about the dome, because you had pictures of it in the book, but you never really talked about it.
Well, it took us nearly the whole 10 years to build.
Okay.
And by the time we built it, and it was very small, it was not the one we wanted to build. We wanted to build a 36-inch, and this one was a 20. It wasn't big enough to live in, but we were already separated emotionally and mentally by the time the skin went on it. So I do mention a couple of places in the book that I would go up to the dome at 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning and write for a couple of hours. Then I would go milk the goats, and then I would head out to work. And John would go into the dome and work there when he was working on his programming. So we kind of used it as an office. After I moved off the land, John finished it. I don't think he'd put glass in it while I was still there, or maybe he had, but we just barely put glass in it. He did the interior. It was just a big open dome when I was there. But after I left, he built a kitchen into it and a bathroom, and he moved in, and he lived there for quite a number of years. And it's still there. It's still up on the land. His widow rents it now to a nice couple.
I'm gonna have to take a little field trip, I think, to Morgan Hill and see if I can spot this dome. I'll just knock on the door.
Well, here's an interesting story. My next door neighbor in Santa Cruz is not a back to the lander. In fact, he's probably not even of the same political persuasion I am, but he's a good neighbor. And he said, "Hey, I heard you wrote a book. It was in the paper." And I said, "Yeah, I did. Would you like to see it?" And he said, "Yeah." So I gave it to him. Now he's a long distance cyclist, and he's in his 50s, but he's in very, very good shape. So he told me about 6 months later, he said, "It took me about 6 months to read your book. But then I decided to take a trip. I got on my bike and I went over to Morgan Hill and I went up the road and I found it."
That's awesome.
He said,
That is a
I
good
saw the
neighbor.
sign on a tree up there that made me decide not to knock on the door. And I saw this too when I went up to take pictures just before the book was published. I went up there with a friend who had lived up there with us. And we were going to take, well, we took a lot of pictures, but we were going to take some pictures from the top of the hill down to the dome. It would have been a really nice view. And on the tree, just at the top of the driveway, it said, "Due to the cost of ammunition, no warning shots will be fired."
Oh God.
We decided that whoever was living there these days probably didn't want company.
Yeah, I think you're right. The Back to the Land takes place in such a particular moment in time. But I'm wondering what you think are the lessons that we could take from it now. Like if somebody who is 20 years old or 30 years old now reading that book, living in the time that we live in.
I think it's very important for people to be able to find a space in time and in physical space where they can be at peace. We all run around, well, and many of us have found that during the pandemic, to be quite truthful. If I were speaking just before the pandemic, I would say we do so much, we're worried about so many things, and now we're worried about even more. We may not be racing around like we used to do, but we're worried all the time. People are worried about their futures, their jobs, their ability to buy a house, their children, their safety, so many things. You need to find a space that is wholesome and peaceful. And that might be as simple as a couple of boxes in the backyard where you plant vegetables, or it might be some hanging flowers that you put in your patio. Or it might be the herbs that you plant and then you put into your food. I encourage people to go back to basics, to learn to bake bread, to learn how to make yogurt, to learn how to chop fresh vegetables and fresh herbs into their meals. And that's why I'm revising my cookbook. My new cookbook is going to be called Organic Cooking for Not So Organic Families. And I'm trying to go back to the idea that we can have a back to the land experience without having to go back to the land.
I agree. And I think that one of the things that a lot of us discovered during the pandemic is that we started asking ourselves, okay, worst case scenario, tomorrow, how would the world falls apart? Would I be able to take care of myself? Would I be able to survive? And so I think you're so right. A lot of us were in that mindset. That's why, all the sourdough bread baking took off this past year, and everybody, baking banana bread and, doing all these things. So it's good to know that you can do those things, you have those skills in your back pocket, just in case the world really does fall apart tomorrow. So,
And I was taught some of these skills by people who have been thinking about it for a very long time. We have a large Mormon community in Morgan Hill. I think it's still a large Mormon community. Certainly in the 70s it was. It was a stake center. And I was invited frequently to come to group meetings as somebody who was a bit of an authority on natural foods. I had a natural food store. I wrote these books and so forth. I wrote a column. So I would come into these groups and I might be able to offer a little tiny bit of knowledge about something. But what I discovered was that the Mormon women were making sure that they had enough food, and they were sort of fine tuning their plans to how to have a year's supply of food for their families in case there was some kind of an emergency. And I learned from them how to do that, how to stock powdered milk and how to stock wheat berries, for example, some oil, and be able to store these things in containers that would keep the bugs out and keep the heat out and so forth. And then I found myself making friends, and they would invite me to bread making classes, butter making classes, yogurt making classes, sausage making classes. So a lot of the things that I put into my book, a lot of the things I learned that I used with my children came from this group of women who were very much in the idea of self-sufficiency.
amazing. Amazing.
Well, it
I
was
learn a lot. I learn a lot from Mormon mommy blogs too. They're
Yes,
just
yes.
very good at like adulting and life. So, you know, a lot to emulate there. We are almost at the top of the hour. So do we have any more questions for Marlene or comments?
I'd love to just hear from some of you about.
One comment I would like to say, when you mentioned that Dory died, and then you mentioned that John and you had gotten a divorce and he had died, and it hurt my heart. So I think telling your story touched us because we felt it. So thank you for doing that, because it made me feel so sad. You know, that
I very much appreciate that. I hope that the post log that I wrote helped a little bit.
it helped a little bit. It's still, especially with Dory, I thought she went through a lot, and then to end up in divorce and then dying, it was like, she deserved better.
We all thought that too.
Yeah, but thank you for sharing those things.
Thank you for that.
Well, Marlene, when the book arrived at my house after I ordered it from Amazon, my husband got a hold of it first, and he said, "Oh, well, just let me look at this." Pretty soon he was on it a number of nights, and it wasn't available for me to even read. So for a while, he so much enjoyed it. He says this is just a really gripping story. And of course, we have built our own house here in Alexandria, and Dick was very interested in hearing about the permitting process, which was just so impossible for him and all that. We had a much easier time of it, but it was just so interesting to hear all the details. And you became so handy with building things and animals, and well, you have our admiration. And I got the book afterwards and I did the same thing. Couldn't put it down. Well, thank you.
I read it in one night, I think.
Oh,
Yeah. I
Kathy
had to know what happened.
Kathy and I had the most interesting coincidence happen in our lives. And that is that, first of all, she was already in Washington, D.C. when I moved there. And then she found out that we had the Morgan Hill connection, and her sister was living in Morgan Hill and had a son very close to the age of my oldest daughter. So for the rest of our childbearing years, so to speak, Auntie Kathy would come out and visit, and we would get to see her. I would go to school events to see my children in various things, and there would be my old Girl Scout leader, Kathy's mom, at the same event because she was grandma and coming to see her children. So these kinds of coincidences, I just think they're so precious. They're very much, they linked my childhood with my adulthood. And then later on, as I got to know Kathy's sister and her husband and their family, that they gave me a whole new perspective on the world.
Marlene, if you have a few minutes, I think that the question, I'm sorry, I don't know your first name, J. Doug, so I'm just gonna say J. Doug. I think it's an interesting question, and I know that you probably can't give a long answer, but do you want to give a short answer?
Sure, sure. I'm actually rewriting a section in my book right now that addresses this question. The question was, as a tangential thought, during the time you started living away from the city, has your idea of what organic means changed? First of all, organic didn't mean a lot in the 70s. I don't think we could distinguish between organic food, natural food. We weren't really using the term whole food yet. We did use the term health food. What was the difference between health food, natural food, and organic food? I swear we did not know. Today, there are definitions and there are ways of identifying food that has been grown totally without pesticides or hormones and the various aspects of animal treatment and plant treatment that most gardens, most farms use. I try to define those terms in my book, my new book, and I definitely think that now we know what organic means because it's been identified, it's been inspected, it's been, there are certain requirements of the people who are farming that call themselves organic that they have to stick to. And then the food can be labeled organic. So that section in your supermarket that says organic food, it actually is organically grown food. It isn't just a name that we put on it. Now, if it says natural food, all that means is probably we didn't put any shoe leather in it. You know, I mean, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's healthy or that it's whole. I like the term whole foods, which is something very new, not because it's the name of a store, because it's referring to the food that has not had any of its parts taken away from it. Does that help a little bit?
8, 9 years ago, we had an occasion to be in Pennsylvania, and we stayed at a bed and breakfast place where they actually were preparing to raise their organic chickens. It was Mennonites that had these farms and these barns, that she made mention of like 100, she was preparing for 100,000 chicks to be delivered for this, that were organic. But she said that the hardest part of it all was cleaning the barns and making sure birds did not get into the barns.
Oh, how interesting.
That the birds were really just such a negative thing to go into this organic, for the organic chickens.
Right.
And of course, they sold the chickens to a company there in Upper New York State, but that was their main business. That the chickens or the birds was the worst thing, she said, because they contaminate.
They would contaminate them. Yes, they would.
Yeah. And so,
And it's kind of a side talk here. When we were living in, we lived in Alexandria also. When we were living there for that 1 year, we loved to take our weekends out in our Volkswagen bus and go to Pennsylvania or other places nearby. And we often went to the farmers markets that were on Saturdays in the Mennonite area.
yes.
And I got a lot of education about what natural and whole and organic food was. I had grown up with packages of vegetables in the freezer, like so many of us did in the 60s and 70s. My mother was a lover of canned food and packaged food because she'd been through World War II, and that's how they managed to make it through, was with food that they could keep in their cupboards even when they were in the middle of rationing. But there suddenly in Pennsylvania, we were buying basil and fresh tomatoes and fresh corn and taking it back to our Volkswagen bus and cooking and eating it the same night. You know, the night that the corn had been picked. We'd never eaten food like that before. And so that was definitely an influence on me that I carried through when I moved back to California.
The nicest thing about going to this particular bed and breakfast, there was not markings in the road that told us what side of the road we should be on. It was into the country.
Right. We had no line up in the middle of our dirt road either.
Right, it was into the country. We went and we spent a week there, and it was just it was just wonderful. Yeah, no television.
Right, right. Yeah, we had no television either, and my son is now raising a 5-year-old and struggling with what that means to around media, around computers, around iPads. He said it was so much easier for you, Mom. You just moved away from it all. He didn't see a television set till he was 7 or 8 years old.
Yeah, why not? You know. Okay, it is 7:07, so I think it is time to say good night. I'll let Marlene say a few closing words, and then we will be off. So thank you so much, everybody, for joining us tonight.
Thank you all.
And thank you, Julie, for organizing this.
Such as it is. Yes, I'm glad to see the faces that I recognize, and glad you could join us here tonight. So thank you so much. And thank you, Marlene. We always love to talk to the authors in person,
Absolutely.
or at least virtually.
Yeah.
So it's been a treat. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for inviting us into your book group as you did. I love doing these. They certainly help me know that what I'm doing is useful to people and makes me feel that it's a useful endeavor. I will probably keep writing as long as I can. It's not for any of you who are thinking, or might be a nice thing to do. You're not going to make a lot of money writing. It's not, 90% of us make very little money and 10% make all of it. It's just like anything else. But the writing is its own reward. And I just enjoy telling stories, and I enjoy giving people information. I try to keep my my writing skills polished by writing a monthly blog, which some of you I know follow. And I am, as I said, working on several books at once right now, the grandparenting book and the organic cooking book. And I'm also learning how to write a mystery book. I've started writing a mystery novel. I have no idea what I'm doing, but I'm having fun with it. I would hope that you will tell other people about this book. It doesn't get a lot of press, obviously. I published it with a very small publishing company, which means I didn't have to pay to publish it, but he doesn't have a big budget for marketing. So if you like the book and you know somebody else who might like it, I hope you'll tell them. And Christmas is coming. Some people would like to have a Christmas present. Sorry to be so crass, but ending with a commercial. Again, I'm so glad to see you all here. And this was fun.
It was. Thank you so much.
Oh, can we, if you have a copy of the book with you, can you hold it up in the screen and I'll take a screenshot? I think that would be a fun picture. Okay, let me just get my camera set up yet. Okay. And if you don't want to be in the picture, you can turn your camera off. But let's see it. And actually, okay. All right. Let me take the picture. Sorry, I didn't take it yet. Put your books back up. Books back up.
Oh, she wants
All right. Okay.
Upstairs.
All right, here we go. 1, 2, 3. Fabulous. Thank you. Okay, thank you so much, everybody. Have a good night. And this recording will be on YouTube if you want to rewatch it later. But thank you and have a good night.
Thanks,
All
Marlene.
Thanks, Marlene. Bye now.
Here's your books back.